Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. Donald Trump has spent his life posing as a man with nothing to hide, a billionaire exhibitionist whose every scandal is a branding opportunity. But his frantic efforts to stall and narrow the release of the Epstein files betray a very different instinct: fear. The same man who built a political religion around truth-telling and owning the elites is now positioned squarely between the public and one of the most important documentary records of elite predation in modern American history, using the machinery of the state to buy more darkness for people who have already had far too much of it. Jeffrey Epstein's story has always been about more than one depraved man. It has been about the ecosystem that incubated him and then insisted with a straight face that it had no idea what was going on. The Epstein files, the grand jury transcripts, FBI case files, correspondence, and investigative materials Congress tried to pry loose with the Epstein Files Transparency Act are the closest thing this country is ever going to get to a full X-ray of that ecosystem. These are not random gossip clippings. They are sworn testimony, internal government records, the kind of paper trail that can show who had leverage, who had knowledge, and who had a motive to look away. And now, after signing that Transparency Act under pressure, and then slow-walking and slicing and dicing compliance, Trump's administration is hiding behind a tangle of redactions, missed deadlines, and procedural excuses that somehow always tilt in the same direction, toward withholding, toward delay, toward the comfort of the already powerful. This is the part where we should ask out loud the question polite people in Washington prefer to route through passive voice. What is he so afraid of? Trump's history with Epstein is not speculative, it's documented. In 2002, long before anyone could pretend ignorance of who Epstein really was, Trump told New York Magazine, "I've known Jeff for 15 years. Terrific guy. He's a lot of fun to be with. It's even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side." That line, "on the younger side," was sleazy when he said it and chilling now. Add to that the photos, the party videos, the reporting that Epstein bragged about being Don's best friend, the address book entries listing a thicket of Trump's numbers, and the retrospective reconstruction of just how intertwined their social lives were in Palm Beach and New York. In 2019 and after, when Epstein's crimes were once again front-page news, Trump tried to retrofit his narrative. Suddenly, he wasn't a fan, barely knew him, supposedly cut ties long before Epstein's first conviction, all of which has been steadily undermined by reporting and by his own prior statements. None of that proves Trump personally committed crimes with Epstein, but it does explain why documents that capture, in granular detail, who was called, who was invited, who intervened, and who leaned on whom are politically and personally radioactive to a man whose entire mythology depends on being the swaggering outsider, not just another face in the world's ugliest boys' club. The legal choreography around the files is revealing on its own. Congress, under withering public pressure, passes the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a law that doesn't just politely urge disclosure, but tells the Department of Justice, the FBI, and federal prosecutors to get these materials out the door by a date certain, with narrow victim protective exceptions. Trump, ever the showman, ultimately signs it, after early dismissing calls to release the files. And then, once the cameras are gone, his administration begins to behave like a defendant asked to hand over a hard drive. Slow, grudging, hunting for every possible loophole instead of making a good faith effort to meet the deadline. The administration blows past it, prompting Senator Jeff Merkley, the law's lead sponsor, to accuse Trump's team flatly of breaking the law and siding with the rich and powerful to help cover up the abuse of our most vulnerable. The Justice Department leans on familiar doctrines: law enforcement exemptions, grand jury secrecy, the need to protect ongoing investigative equities, even as judges in Florida and New York point out that Congress has now carved a specific democratically enacted exception that tells them in plain English to unseal. When those judges do order grand jury materials unsealed, the picture that emerges is exactly what the political class had reason to fear: a detailed record of how Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were investigated, mishandled, and ultimately allowed to cut a sweetheart deal that kept federal charges off the books for years. To listen to Trump world, this isn't about concealment. It's about protecting the innocent, shielding bystanders from being smeared by uncorroborated allegations. But this concern for reputation rings especially hollow, coming from a man whose own political rise depended on casually accusing entire groups of people of being rapists, terrorists, murderers, or traitors, and whose empathy for due process evaporates the second there's a partisan mileage to be gained. Trump had no problem, for instance, treating Epstein as a punchline and distancing himself only when Epstein's legal risk became too obvious to ignore. Suddenly, when the spotlight swings toward his own circles, the donors, the hangers-on, the friends of friends who pass through Epstein's world, privacy becomes sacred, and the public's right to know becomes a dangerous overreach. At some point, we have to step back and recognize the pattern. Trump fights transparency the way other politicians fight elections, relentlessly, instinctively, without shame. He fought the release of his tax returns all the way to the Supreme Court, fighting subpoenas from Congress and state prosecutors for years. He fought the House's access to January 6 records, stretching executive privilege beyond recognition to try to keep phone logs, drafts, and staff notes buried. He fought the National Archives over classified documents, lied about having returned them, and then turned a legitimate search into a fundraising bonanza. Each time he claimed to be the victim of a witch hunt. Each time, when the documents finally dripped out, they painted a far more damning picture than the denials. The Epstein files fit this pattern like a glove. Trump is not mounting a legal defense so much as a delaying action, hoping that time, redactions, and partisan fatigue will blunt the impact of whatever ultimately emerges. Meanwhile, the damage of that delay falls on the same people who have always borne the cost, the survivors whose testimony is entombed in these case files, and the public that is supposed to be sovereign in a democracy allegedly built on the rule of law. If this sounds abstract, it shouldn't. The Epstein documents matter because they describe in specific interactions and institutional decisions how an extremely well-connected man was able to sexually abuse girls and young women for years while cycling through the company of presidents, princes, billionaires, and media figures. They show how federal prosecutors in Florida invoked secret non-prosecution agreements, how law enforcement deferred, how agencies hid behind instructions from above. They sketch the contours of a protection racket that spanned both parties and multiple administrations. And yes, they intersect with Trump's timeline, with his properties, and with his political rise. In another political universe, a leader whose name wandered anywhere near that story would become a crusader for total disclosure, demanding that every scrap be released so his own conduct could be judged in the open. Trump has done the opposite. He signaled public support for transparency only when cornered, then quietly presided over a process that ended with partially released caches, heavy redactions, and brazen violations of statutory deadlines. That gap between the performance and the practice is the tell. This is not a man confident that the full story flatters him. The Epstein saga also crystallizes something even more corrosive than Trump's personal cowardice: the bipartisan culture of impunity that has long surrounded money and power in the United States. Epstein collected the powerful not just as trophies, but as insurance. Every photo, every log entry, every favor banked was a kind of social collateral. If he ever went down, too many people had a shared interest in making sure the fallout was containable, that the story was framed as a lone monster caught, not as a network exposed. The Epstein Files Transparency Act was, in a way, Congress admitting that the standard tools, FOIA, sporadic leaks, occasional Inspector General reports, had failed to penetrate that network. For Trump to turn around and starve that law of meeting while refusing to comply fully is not just garden variety hypocrisy. It is confirmation that when forced to choose, he will always side with the club. The script practically writes itself at this point. Every time there is a chance to show that the justice system applies even to the gilded set, someone like Trump steps forward and offers up a familiar sermon about order, responsibility, and not smearing people without cause. A sermon delivered without irony by the same man who led crowds in chants to lock her up based on innuendo and conspiracy. Trump likes to brand himself as a nemesis of the elites, but the Epstein Files fight is a rare moment where the mask slips completely. What elite could be more archetypal than a president using his administration to defy a law he signed because the law compels disclosure that might embarrass his rich friends and his own myth of distance from them? What populist spends his political capital making sure the public learns less, not more, about how a wealthy predator was protected? Perhaps the most galling piece of this story is that the system still bends to accommodate this behavior. Even now, after judges in New York and Florida have ordered more grand jury and investigative materials unsealed, the Justice Department is dribbling out files in massive, nearly unreadable dumps, tens or hundreds of thousands of pages at a time, punctuated with expanses of blacked-out text. The administration then points to the volume, not the content, and congratulates itself on historic transparency, as if quantity alone could substitute for candor. Meanwhile, the deadline written into law has slipped, and the president who signed that law shrugs it off as a technical dispute, while his allies attack anyone still demanding full compliance as obsessed or partisan. This is where we have to resist the temptation to tune out. The boredom, the paperwork, the procedural fog, that's the point. Trump doesn't need to win a legal argument on the merits if he can exhaust the public's attention span. But the core moral stakes are not complicated. On one side are survivors, journalists, and a slim majority in Congress who acted on a basic principle. If the United States government collected information about how Epstein was able to operate, and with whose complicity that information belongs, redacted to protect victims, yes to the public. On the other side is a man with an established personal and social history with Epstein, an established pattern of burying any document that might weaken his self-image, and an administration now willing to defy its own transparency law to keep the lid as tight as possible for as long as possible. You don't need a law degree to parse what that means. They just need to ask themselves how many times they're willing to watch the same movie. Trump is counting on repetition to work in his favor, that by the time the last tranche of files is pried loose by courts or future administrations, whatever is in there about him, about his circle, about the compromises made on his watch, will feel like ancient history. But for the women and girls whose lives collided with Epstein's, nothing about those years is abstract or distant. The law Congress passed was supposed to send a clear message that their stories preserved in government records would no longer be hostage to the reputational anxieties of powerful men. Trump's slow-motion sabotage of that promise is a reminder that he does not see them as a constituency that matters. Ultimately, this is what makes his efforts to block, delay, and gut the release of the Epstein files so revealing and so damning. It is not just that Trump is once again at war with the truth. It is that he is at war with the idea that the truth should carry any consequence for people like him at all. He is betting again that enough Americans will accept a world in which there are two tiers of exposure, one for everyone else and another for those who can buy lawyers, elections, and time. The Epstein files represent a crack in that arrangement, a rare moment when Congress, courts, and public pressure aligned to say, no, not this time. The question now is whether Trump's campaign to stuff that genie back into its bottle will succeed, and whether the country is willing, yet again, to let a man who once called Jeffrey Epstein a terrific guy decide much of Epstein's truth the rest of us are allowed to see. On December 30th, the Justice Department made an announcement that it was investigating the Obama-Biden administration for criminal conspiracy in investigating Trump. This is yet another distraction, yet another ruse. We need to see through these, and we need to be very clear. These files must be released, the courts must cooperate, and the American public and the survivors have every right to see what's in them. This has been America's Fractured Politics. If this episode resonated with you, please subscribe, pass it along, and comment. Thank you for listening. Let's not quit until the truth comes out.